Hello, beautiful people. You're going to be looking at my hands and pot for a few minutes before we shift into seeing my face. And I have a cold today. I've had a cold for a few days, so I've been avoiding doing any kind of recording, but I wanted to get the recording done because the spring equinox is coming up, and this is an important time to begin to do your work with the Pysanky if you haven't already done Pysanky with me in previous videos or in previous work with me in person. So I'm going to start by making dye, natural dye that we're going to be submerging the eggs into once we have done the beeswax resist on the egg, drawn the prayers, basically, or written the prayers. And I'm going to teach you a very, very simple dye. You can either make one that uses red cabbage that you have chopped up finely, or you can use onion skins. I'm going to do the onion skins today. I may or may not use the onion skin dye in the video because I've already got some cabbage dye that's made, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So as you see, I've got a big bag of onion skins. If you don't have these handy, you can go to your grocery store and ask them if they can give you some of the onion skins that they have. We can use yellow or red or a combination of the two. I just throw them all into one bag, so I usually use a combo. And whatever pot you've got, you don't need a lot of dye. You know, enough that fits in a very small jar, like a mason jar, small size, 500 mils. So really all you need is a relatively small pot. Okay, and I'm going to fill it right to the top with the onion skin, so it'll be a little noisy. Sorry about that. It might look like I'm overfilling, but I'm actually not overfilling because there's a lot of airspace between the skins and I want to have a good rich dye. So I'm just going to shove them down a little bit. And maybe one more little bit. Okay. I'm going to get this out of the camera view. So now you see our pot. You can see I'm picking up a couple pieces off the floor. And I'm going to put my pot on a fairly low temperature. This is a little single burner. You can do it on your stovetop up you know, wherever you can have consistent heat. And I can turn it to maybe a medium low or low. You're going to want to let this simmer when you've added the water. You don't want to let it boil. It actually destroys the color when you let it boil. So you only bring it up to a simmer and then you leave it to simmer for 45 minutes to an hour. So you're not going to stay on the video with me that whole time. I'm adding in distilled water. Sometimes I use spring water. Well water is lovely if you have it. I tend not to use city water. City water has chemicals added to it. Those chemicals can interfere with, again, your color production. When I add the water, I'm going to add the water so that it's level with the amount of skins that I have. Some of that water will evaporate. That's perfect. I'm going to check my level because I've got so many skins in here, it's kind of hard to see. Yes, okay. I like to use a wooden instrument to do my stirring. That's the witch in me who likes to use the wood. It's also because I don't want to use a metal that may or may not be reactive. So the type of pot that I'm using today is stainless steel. Stainless steel is not reactive with the dye, so it will not shift or change or alter the color. That's a good thing to start with for beginners in terms of natural dye. Find yourself a stainless steel or ceramic and make your dye in that. Now, you can see that the water is quite high. As it simmers over time, the water will evaporate. I want that to happen because I want the color to concentrate. Now that I have the skins submerged, I can choose if I want to add some. I think I will add just another handful or so. Once I have all of the skins submerged, my job will be to leave it alone and let it do its own work. Come and check on it and absolutely monitor the temperature. If you see it starting to boil, turn it down. You don't want it to boil, you just want it to simmer. So that's my work over the next little while. Once I get it up to a simmer, I will reduce my temperature to kind of a low temperature. Not so much that it's, just on barely keeping it warm, but enough, reduce it enough that it's not at risk of boiling. Then, when we're done with creating the dye, I'll have to strain out all of the skins. Just use a big sieve, strain it out, and pour your dye into a jar that has a lid. Okay, that's step 1 in your process. Step 2 is going to be gathering the things that you're going to need to make your Pysanka. So, equipment that you're going to need. So one piece of equipment that you're going to need, this is the die. This is the jar. It's about a 500 milliliter jar. You can see at the very top of the jar I have left an air space. About 1/3 of the jar air, the rest of it dye. The reason being that when you take your Pysanka, your egg, and submerge it into the dye, of course it's going to cause the dye to rise. The word just went out of my head. And then spill over. So if you give it airspace, you won't have that problem. Okay, so don't fill your dye all the way up to the top of your jar. 500 milliliter jar, find a lid. Of course, you're going to need an egg. The kind of egg actually is important. Of course, any egg can do, any color of egg will work. However, a fresh farm egg is going to take the dye more readily, more easily than if you were working with a store-bought egg, generally speaking. Generally speaking, store-bought eggs, and here I'm talking about factory-produced eggs, they make use of cleaning, I don't know what the word is, chemical soaps that can create a residue on the outside of the egg where the egg will not as readily take the dye. Now, you can rectify that by doing washing of the egg, but that may or may not sometimes remove some of those residues. So if you can get a farm fresh egg, that would be awesome. You will find it will take the dye much more easily. Now, in terms of talismanic power, the best kind of egg to find would be one that was laid by a point-of-lay hen. If you can get all of these factors to come together, you're doing really amazingly. A point-of-lay hen means it's when she's finally matured enough that she's laying eggs. So it's her very first egg that she's ever laid, and that it's laid on a new moon in spring, the first new moon of spring. And if you can get all of those things to align, and that egg is a good egg to work with, then you can make a really powerful talisman. But if you can't find all of those factors, just a farm egg. Maybe if you can find one that was laid on the new moon, great. It doesn't have to be necessarily a point-of-lay hen, and it doesn't have to be on the new moon. Just get a farm egg. You'll also need to have a beeswax candle. So beeswax is traditionally used. There's a lot of lore around why we work with beeswax. I'll say more about it as we get into the project. And you'll notice that I actually have a bowl filled with little beeswax pieces that have soot in them. I like using the wax that has soot. The reason being that it's actually easier for me to see what I'm writing onto my egg, especially because I personally don't use pencil lines. I don't create a pencil drawing ahead of time. I just work with it freehand. And so when I'm doing that, using the black actually is easier for me to see where the lines are. Again, you don't need to do that if you're going to do pencil lines. Just, you'll probably be able to see where you've gone over with the beeswax. But if not, you could get a beeswax candle that has some sort of dye added to it. You can find red ones or other such colors that are beeswax. And then you'll need an instrument for the writing. Now, I'm using something that was a gift given to me by a friend. This is called a kitska, and it's a little tool. You can see that it's got a pointed end. There's sort of a funnel at the top. It's been well used. It's really getting quite worn down, actually, and I might need to do my own little fix and make an end where I can put the metal parts over on the other end, because this wood is slowly disappearing over time as it becomes more and more soot. And the reason that we use a metal funnel or a metal tip is that as we take the tip and place it into the flame of our candle, it heats up. And as it heats up, well, you're going to see that I actually have some wax still left on here. That wax is going to melt, and you'll see that it's starting to drip. So it takes a good, fast, steady hand to know what you're doing with this kind of a tool. If you find one of these, either at a craft shop, or if you go to a special Ukrainian cultural center and they're selling these, great, work with one. There are ones that are made, let's see if I can grab it easily. Excuse all the noise. There are other ones that have more of a funnel. Those ones are also useful. I actually really like this for many reasons, because it was a gift from my friend. Her grandfather made it. That to me holds great meaning, and because it was gifted to me, it holds more power. These ones are lovely. You can put a lot of wax into the funnel. It'll drip through, usually more consistently than this particular instrument, but this instrument and I have become really good friends through the years, so I actually know how to pay attention to it, listen to it, and work with it. I feel a great kinship with it. Other people really prefer these, and they come in different sizes, with the tip openings here could be wider or smaller depending on the kind of line that you want to make. So these can be really wonderful as well, and these are the ones that you'll probably seen sold in the Ukrainian cultural centers. However, other things that I've seen that are creative, useful tools, and this is maybe one that you look out for as well, is get yourself one of the old style writing dip pens. Okay, and they come with removable nibs. Those nibs can be very useful in this kind of a work. Now, one that's too pointy won't necessarily be able to scrape away at hard beeswax, but you can get it started by taking a little tiny bit of beeswax onto the tip, heating it up, grabbing a bit more wax, maybe around the candle, and now you've got something that will drip the wax as you write on your egg. I personally wouldn't use such a fine tip as this one. It's a little bit too pointy for my tastes. This one has a little bit of a rounded tip as far as a nib goes. And this one is perhaps somewhere in between the two. So those are possibilities for use because they're metal. They funnel the beeswax to a fine point, and then you can use them very similar to how you would with a pen. Your hand positioning would probably be more comfortable and familiar for most people who aren't used to using the other instrument. This one would be a good alternative. Okay. So once you have those at your disposal, now you have what you need in order to make a Pysanka, aside from your design. So in terms of writing a Pysanka, what we're using is a symbolic language. It's a language built of symbols that represent whatever our intention and prayer is. There are very traditional symbols that are used to write Pysanky, and then there are symbols that are more personally meaningful to you. And I will encourage you to start with ones that are meaningful to you. So when you think about what it is that you would like your Pysanka to represent, the prayer you would like it to hold, and the function you would like it to do, that will give you an idea of what you want to create as your written symbolic prayer. And egg is a beautiful canvas. I usually divide my egg up into sort of 4 surfaces or 3 surfaces, depending on what I'm working with. Well, actually, that's not true. One surface I work with is at the very tip and at the very bottom of the egg. Then I'll have faces 1, 2, 3, 4 to cover the whole surface of the egg. Or I could have 3, 1, 2, and 3. So when I sit down to develop the prayer and the symbolic way of representing that prayer, if I was uncertain about what exactly it is that I want to represent, then I would start with a piece of paper and just write. Write out your thoughts, write out your intentions, write out your prayer, pick out the key words. And when you've decided on what the key thoughts or words are within the entire prayer or intention, how would you represent those key thoughts in a symbol? What would you like? What symbol would you like that encapsulates the idea and the feeling that you want to convey? Once you have those symbols written out on a piece of paper, then you can compile them into what looks like a picture or a design. It can be really, really simple. Maybe you're thinking about spring and blossoms and the blossoming of your own personal energy. So maybe you're going to make flowers. So you'll draw a few flowers on your piece of paper and use that as your template for what you then want to create on the surface of the egg. If you feel perhaps a little bit unsure about just doing a freehand style, use a soft pencil, not too dark, not too heavy with your lines, and just make an outline of the design of the flower or whatever else that you're creating on the surface of your egg. From that point, then we begin to work with the wax. So I'm not going to sit with you through the writing of your whole Pysanka. You don't need to sit with me through the writing of my whole Pysanka, which is probably a better way of saying that. I want to show you this is the bottom of the egg. I'm currently writing the top of the egg. And I haven't done any of the sides yet. You'll drop in with me at different points for this project. Partly because it does take quite a bit of concentration not to drip wax all over the place and all over the Pysanka. And partly because it's just simply a long process that doesn't need a lot of instruction once you get going. So I'll take you through a little bit of it right now, and we'll talk a bit about the use of Pysanky and the history. This kistka, you can see, is dripping. I usually wait until I've had a few drips, and then I can see that there's no other big drips that are going to form, so now I can place my kistka tip onto the egg to begin to write the lines. So I said this is a good time of year to begin to do your work with the Pysanky. Pretty much any time of year is a good time. You may hear people who refer to the Pysanky as Easter eggs, or that they write them at Easter. And that's true since the Christianization of Slavic countries. You will see that a lot of the practices that were part of the folk practices, the old folk practices, were taken over by the church because they were having a hard time converting peasants to Christianity. The upper class, more affluent, and such folk, they had an easier time of being convinced to become part of the church. Peasant folk wanted to retain their folk practices, their earth practices. So, as a part of the tactics of trying to have people become part of the Christian church, a lot of the practices of the folk, um, the the peasant folk, were taken over by the church. So, for example, these were turned into Easter eggs. And interesting, in terms of the affiliation of the timing, because the most powerful talisman, as I mentioned before, were from the point of lay hens on the first new moon in spring. So you think about what that symbolically means, like the fertility of life, the vibrancy of life, and um, the fact that an egg means the continuity of life. It is life force itself. And understanding what the talisman of a Pysanka actually means, when the egg retains its contents as part of the talisman, what's inside the egg are the waters of life, which is the white, and a miniature sun, which is the yolk. These are all symbols that are potent symbols to those who work with the earth traditions and the earth medicines. Here, when I say earth, I don't just mean like the physical earth, but earth and its relationship to the cosmic forces, the elementals, spirits, spirit world. So these are not just simply Easter eggs. Making a Pysanka or many Pysanky at this time of year um, is a powerful time to do it, because now you can use these as talismans and amulets for the coming season. For example, these would often be gifted to the garden, the first furrow of the garden, um, just before the seeding and the growing seasons, so that you can ensure that the garden is protected, the things that are growing in there are protected, that there will be good fertility, and that you are imparting both the energies of the waters of life as well as the solar force within that garden. You might also gift one to, if you had beehives, the old beehives were in tree trunks that were hollow and then often had like little thatched roofs on them, raised up off the ground. And so you would gift this to the bees, because you do want to be able to continue to work with the bees for both honey and wax and just fertility, again, pollinating your crops. Honoring the bees for their work, honoring them for what they represent as co-inhabitants on the land that you're on. And then they would be used for bringing fertility or recognizing fertility of humans as well, helping to ensure fertility if a woman was perhaps having a difficult time getting pregnant, or they might be given as a gift to someone that you might have interest in and, potentially companionship. So the purpose of Pysanky is manyfold. There are many different reasons to write a Pysanka, and that's just a few. I've only mentioned just a very small handful. The colors that we choose for the Pysanka, again, are meaningful. The color red is a very strong color. It's considered like the lifebloods. There's the color black or near black that you can make as well. Greens are harder to achieve with natural color, but they can be achieved. They would also be used. Yellows would be another common color. And then whatever other colors that your eggshell might have as its natural base color can be a part of the design as well. Modern day Pysanky tend to use chemical dyes, but there is a growing resurgence and interest in using the natural dyes and taking the time to experiment and see what kind of colors you can create. Of course, you know my leaning. I lean toward working with the natural, so that's why we're making our own natural dye for this project. Working with the eggshell, one part to remember with the canvas of the eggshell is that it's curved. And so it's okay if your design is not perfectly straight lined, even though you might be trying to make some straight lines. It's actually nicer to work with the curve and incorporate some curved lines into your design. Curved lines can be visually you can have more forgiveness for curved lines on your design. Making something look like it has straight lines on a curved surface excuse me, can be quite challenging. You can also see that the black is lovely because it stands out more, and I can actually really see where I'm working, especially with a brown egg. If I was just to use natural beeswax on a brown egg, it's going to be a little bit more challenging for me to see what I've actually created in terms of the thickness. So there's a difference between doing a talisman that has the contents of the egg removed and a talisman that retains its contents. The talisman that retains its contents is what we would call like a true talisman or a strongest talisman. It is one that you also have to take good care of. For example, if you let that talisman get overheated, the contents tend to explode. And if that Pysanka has been sitting for several months or even years and it decides to explode, the smell in your space is going to be horrible. Imagine the worst possible rotten eggs, and when it explodes, it spews its contents all over everything around it, can sometimes shoot it way across the room. So cleaning up that mess can be quite a thing. So you're tasked as the maker and or caretaker of a talisman to truly caretake that talisman, to not be sloppy or mindlessly caring for it. It's actually quite a responsibility. Part of the care is so then making sure that it's not in direct sunlight, that it's in a temperate room, a room that has a fairly even, moderate temperature. That if you're transporting it any place, like maybe you have to move or something like that, or if you're bringing it to a different room, that you're going to carry it with care, that you're mindful of little hands who might be very curious about it. Of course, we want to encourage little hands to be able to see, understand, and know what it is that they're curious about. And at the same time, with young people, that curiosity can sometimes not include necessarily making sure that the talisman won't drop. So I explained on one of my other videos what happened at one of the exhibits where I had the Pysanky on display. The Pysanky that were the display exhibit ones have a hole on either end and the contents have been blown out. And then I put a wire through and can hang the Pysanka from the base of one of the motanki. And so I had 13 hangings, groups of talismans around the space. And it was in the lobby of the Performing Arts Center where I was living at the time. And there was a children's show that was being put on probably within the first week or two of the show being up. And one of the girls was really curious, really lovely and curious. And so she reached up to the Pysanka and she grabbed it and it crushed. It crushed in her hand. And she was mortified and her parents were mortified and the people who were hosting the show were mortified. And so they tentatively called me and said, I'm so sorry to let you know, but one of the eggs was broken. We've saved all of the little shells because they knew it was a talisman, the ceremonial art, and they put it all into a little paper cup. Luckily, because I'm familiar with making Pysanky, it was easy enough for me to make a duplicate, and I had recorded the design, so I knew what the design was for that particular Pysanka. So I made it over a weekend and I brought it in and rehung the Pysanka for the rest of the exhibit. And this brings up an important point. When you feel like your Pysanka has completed its job, when you feel like it is done the prayer that it was designed to do, and you want to dispose of your talisman, there are specific rules and ways to dispose of a ceremonial object. You will either take the Pysanka and bury it, and you will need to bury it where no feet will walk and trample over it. I tend to bury it underneath the roots of trees, under bushes, like under the roots of bushes, or I'll put it in the crack or sort of like in a large rock formation. If there's some cracks or crevices, I can put it into that. Or if I find a boulder that has sort of a cave space under it, then I'll put it into the cave space under the boulder. So be creative, but also be respectful. And realize that also, if it is a whole egg, when you bury it, it may get dug up by animals. I've had that happen a couple of times in some of my land ceremonies. So just be mindful that might happen. If your Pysanka breaks, either while you're making it or when it's already in its whole intact form, it usually means that the medicine or the prayer for which it was created is complete. They say that the medicine is complete, in which case, again, I will dispose of the Pysanka ceremoniously. You can put it into water, usually wild running water, and that's one valid way of also releasing a Pysanka. It's not common. You can also burn it, but I would be very careful again if it has all of its contents. Make sure that it burns and not explodes. You don't need an explosion in a fire. It's not a nice thing. So my favorite way of releasing them is by burying them, if you haven't figured that out already. So I want to show you what's now been created. I've got the top and the bottom, and they frame or create 4 different potential sides for me to then begin writing the rest of the prayer, which I'm going to get started on, and we'll rejoin again when I've done more. So I have just poured off my dye. Here was the original pot it was cooking in. I still have to clean it. I've poured it into another pot through a sieve. That's the amount of dye that was created and yielded from the onion skins. That's probably enough for 2 little jars. I just wanted to also show, though, that you can do a little bit of magic with the leftover onion skins. So this is a piece of repurposed silk. I don't have many silks or wools that I work with directly, partly because I'm allergic to wool, but I still work with it just in limited quantities. And then silk, I don't find very often at thrift stores, and I'm not given it as donations very often. This one has a little tiny stain, and it's about the same color. The stain is about the same color as the onion skins, which currently are wrapped in this piece of paper towel. So I thought, rather than just tossing my onion skins, what I'm going to do is put them onto the piece of silk. And we're going to do a little bit of work with chemistry here. So predominantly I work with plant-based fiber. And I know that right now we're working on a Pysanka project, but this actually relates to working with the eggshells as well. So predominantly I work with plant-based fibers, which require quite a bit of working with preparations before you do any kind of dye work with them. So in this case, when you have something that is animal-based, so silk and wool, they don't require quite as much pre-work. You can still do what's called scouring and mordanting so that the dye more readily takes, but the dye will naturally more readily take, natural dye will more readily take with the animal fibers than it does with plant-based fibers. So one of the magic pieces about working with onion skin, which is different than if you made your red cabbage dye, is that onion skins naturally have tannins in them. So the tannin in the onion skin actually acts as a mordant. And what a mordant does is it allows the dye, the natural dye, to bind to the protein structure of whatever it is that you're dyeing, which is, in this case, I'm going to wrap the silk up and let it absorb whatever is left in these onion skins. That's the same thing with the eggshells for the Pysanky. Now, I use many different dye on the Pysanky, and they all react quite lovely with the eggshell. Some take more readily than others. The eggshell is something that absorbs the dye quite beautifully. If I was to take a piece of cotton and do this, because of the onion skins, again, the natural tannins in them, the cotton would also take the tannin, but it wouldn't be as strong as like what we'll get with the silk. I'm actually going to wrap this and bind it, and then leave it to sit overnight just as an experiment. Usually I would steam bath these kinds of rolled cloth experiments, but this one I'm just going to do a cold dye binding and see what happens. In any case, what we're going to do now is just to take the dye that we've created, pour it into 2 jars. Remember to leave a 1/3 air space, and that will be used for doing our Pysanky. So I'm bringing you in. Yes, it's the next day. I'm wearing different clothing. Usually I do same-day medicine, and if you've watched any of the Rites other projects, I'm usually doing it all in one take. But because I've been sick and because I was starting to feel kind of low energy yesterday, I decided to wrap it up the next day. I'm still within a 24-hour sort of window. If you want to technically call that same-day medicine, it's not technically same-day medicine. Usually you do it in one sitting. I'm forgiving myself on that though, just because of not wanting to overtax myself and not be fully present and in integrity for the medicine. So this is what I've completed so far. You've seen this and this. So I've got two different faces that are working with one of the symbols that I tend to work a lot with exhibit Pysanky and Pysanky that are gifts for the land. And this is actually an exhibit Pysanka. And it relates to the last ceremony that I did when I was actually staying at my son's place looking after my grandson for almost 2 weeks. And so I did a ceremony at that piece of land. And the first time that I had ever stayed there, there are deer who love to come through and find places in the bush and under the little short trees where they can hunker down out of the winds and out of the snow. And so when I was there the first time, I watched as one of the young deer, looks like a yearling, took shelter in a snowstorm, and the winds were blaring through and snow was going sideways. And anyway, so these are all deer skull, and these arms that come off here, they're all representing the winds that blow, which can be powerful helpers. The winds that blow can be powerful helpers in carrying our prayers and thoughts with them. So I'm using the wind in a positive sense there. And the skulls are nestled within a yoni, which is a representation of the great mother force, the force of creation. And on the other side, similar sort of symbolism, just done in a different way. Here, you see two very simplified deer skull merged in the center. And that is one symbol that is sometimes used for Devana. Devana is the Slavic deity or goddess who works with the forests and the wild animals and helps to protect them. And then sort of on the side of that symbol, you see another one that looks almost like a W, and that represents earth itself, land. So I'm making prayers for the land, prayers that the land be healthy and fertile, also held with the symbol of Mukash. When you get to the place where you're complete or near completing your written prayer, and it can be fancy, it can be simple, I used the example yesterday of flowers. There's sometimes a tendency to want to kind of rush through and, oh, I'm almost done. And we lose some of the concentration that we might have, or we might be a little bit more careless with our beeswax. I find actually the last stages are the ones where I need to practice the most patience with myself and with whatever it is that I'm creating as a prayer, because that's also the time when the most mistakes happen. Now you see me tapping this here after I've heated it. So I heat it. I tap because I can see that there's a drip forming of the beeswax. And if I put that big drip directly onto the egg, it's just going to make a big blob. And I don't want a blob. I'm making a line. And excuse me, I'm not going to blah, blah, blah talk. I'm actually going to concentrate on making the lines right now. You can be here with me through that. So I do encourage you to begin to explore symbols And that can be symbols that are personally meaningful to you, like we talked about yesterday or earlier on the video. That can also be symbols that are meaningful to your ancestors or your cultural elders. I'm working with symbols that are um, meaningful culturally to me. And I'm also working with personal symbols, and I mix them freely in my work. I don't feel that I need to be tied to one or the other. I find it actually really powerful to work with them in a mixed format. To me, it's what makes the most sense because that's basically me being true to myself and true to my own experiences, true to symbols that show up to me either in dream time or in my day to day experiences, directly with the spirits, with the land. Um, and yet I'm also open to seeing, learning from my ancestral teachers, cultural teachers, showing me the magic and the wisdom in some of the more traditional symbols. You may find also that some of the symbols that are cultural or traditional will morph and change over time as you practice them. I don't think that they were meant to be static. That's just me personally. I might be way off. My sense of them is that the more that I work with them, the more they actually evolve through my own hands and through my own practice. Each of them embodying the energy of they, what I want them to carry, depending on the setting, depending on what it is that I'm actually creating, whether it's an embroidered piece or a bound piece or something written like this. And that's a really potent practice within working with the Pysanky. So if you find yourself called to work with this as a medium, you'll probably also find that your work will evolve. The symbols that you draw on, not just that you draw, but you draw on, that you work with, will also evolve with time. If you find that your beeswax kind of globs, one of the things that you can do is incorporate any kind of glob, that's a technical term, any kind of um, mistake into the actual piece. So, for example, I ended up elongating different parts of the lines because the wax was too thick or too globbed, that lovely technical term. And I haven't lost the essence of what I was drawing. I just have slightly shifted the size that it ends up being. I've decided, even though we together on this video, I demonstrated the making of the onion dye, and I will use the onion dye quite happily. Um, I poured the majority of it into one jar. I still had some left over, so I ended up using that to do a little bit of dyeing on some fabric that I had sitting and waiting. I will use the onion dye for a Pysanka that I'm going to make in the next few days. That will be a gift for the land. This one I'm going to do a dip into the cabbage, the red cabbage dye. So if you decided you wanted to use red cabbage instead of the onion skins, you would have chopped up the red cabbage and done the exact same process of simmering it, simmering, stirring, not letting it boil. And after 45 minutes to an hour or so, you will probably have seen that the cabbage itself looks kind of translucent. And like it's lost a lot of its color. Then you know you're done. So let the dye cool and let it sit with the leaves of the cabbage and or the skins of the onion inside the pot, inside the liquid while it's cooling, because it will still be transferring some of the dye. And then you can use a sieve and separate the chunks of skin and cabbage from the actual dye liquid. Well, so here's one of those instances where it's globbed, which means that I'm just simply going to thicken my lines, create a slightly different shape without losing the essence of what I'm making. Okay, one more side. And then we're going to dip it in the dye, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. Now, if you have left the contents of your egg inside the shell, and again, that is like the strongest kind of a talisman, then you'll probably won't find it difficult to get your egg to submerge. Usually it submerges quite nicely into the dye. Sometimes if there's too much of an air pocket inside of the Pysanka, you might notice that one end kind of tips up toward the sky while the rest of the egg remains submerged. And there's an easy solution for that, or if this is for exhibit, so this one does not have the contents in it. If you find that one side is tipping up, or if you don't have contents in it, then you'll need something that will help weight the egg down into the liquid so that it's completely covered and coated. Excuse me. I usually use a teeny tiny jar that I turn upside down That helps to keep the egg submerged. We've got a couple more lines to do. Lovely. Now we're done. Bless. Complete. Complete. It's okay that they look different side to side. Still working with the same symbolism. All right. I will be back momentarily. So I'm back. And here's my dye. This is the cabbage dye. I've used it a few times already, so it may not be as strong as it once was. And hopefully it will still work for the egg. We'll find out. If I don't get enough results on it, then I can use the onion dye, and I'll just dip it a second time. This is going to sit for 24 hours. I wouldn't leave it sitting much longer than that, because sometimes what happens is that depending on the kind of dye, you might find that your egg begins to get too soft. You'll see that when I put it in, it's just floating at the top. That's not going to work very well, is it? So what I do is I take my little tiny jar. It's been used a lot of times. It's got lots of dye on it. And I turn the jar upside down to push the egg down. And as it's upside down, there's an air pocket on the top of the egg right now. So what I do is I slightly tip this to let bubbles escape. That means that the dye is filling up the bottom part of that little tiny jar so that the entire egg can have dye coating it. And I'm going to leave it in here with the lid on, partly because of the smell of the cabbage dye, but also just so that nothing brushes it or tips it or whatever. I'll leave it in here for 24 hours. Like I said, when I take the egg out, if I'm not satisfied with the way that the dye has adhered to it, and I can tell that it's not going to be a very strong dye bath just because it's been used a number of times, and that means that the dye is losing its strength, then I can just let the egg dry and I'll re-dip it into onion dye. And just because I mentioned it, here I'm letting these pieces of cloth sit in the onion dye for 24 hours. Tomorrow I will take them out, wring them out, rinse them in the sink. Yes, you're going to lose a lot of color when you rinse it, but what adheres to the cloth is now on the cloth, as opposed to the what you might imagine is dye on the cloth if you just take it out and wring it and it looks nice and dark. Because as soon as it goes into a washing machine, that stuff's going to all come out. So do a rinse. Whatever's left on the cloth after the water starts to run clear, that's actually the dye that's adhered to the cloth. These are plant-based cloths, so I don't expect the color is going to stay really strong on the cloth. The experiment that we did with the leftover onion skins, and I wrapped it in the silk and bound it, I'm letting that sit in the other room for 24 hours, and again I'll take that and reveal it, and we might just throw it all into the same video here just for the fun of it. Okay, so I'll check back with you in 24 hours. So here we are, last step. My Pysanka has sat for 24 hours, and surprisingly enough, I had a really good result. with the dye. I wasn't anticipating that because I've used it a few times already, but it's still keep going. That beautiful red cabbage dye is still working its magic. So that's the little jar that I used to weigh it down. If you've kept the contents inside of your Pysanka, then you're going to need a spoon to very carefully lift it out. And here you can see how incredibly dark that dye is. I'm going to cover it because the one thing about red cabbage dye as it ages, as it's, it's basically fermenting and smells quite strong. So I'm going to dry off the Pysanka. And what you're going to need for this next stage is a candle that has the flame fairly close to the surface of the candle. So either you have a brand new little tea light, or you have a votive or a taper, or if you're using one of the big pillars, then I usually cut off the excess on the top so that I can have the flame near the surface, and I'd keep that excess, all the little bits and pieces, go into a bag stored so that I can use them for making other candles, or use them for doing Pysanky. But I feel like I've dried it off enough. Okay, so here's a close-up of it before we've started to remove the wax. You need a cloth that you don't mind getting a whole bunch of wax on, that's not going to come out. And please, when you're done with this, do not throw away your cloth. The cloth is considered sacred. We're using wax that's being removed from a ceremonial object. Even though this is looking messy, we use these in ceremonies, and I usually do both sides. This one's completely full. I'm working on the other side right now. And when it's done, you can cut it up into smaller pieces, like smaller little cloths. And we use those little cloths in wiping ceremonies. The idea being that because the wax itself has the solar force, as well as the blessing from the bees, and because that wax was used specifically to make a ceremonial object, it has the potency to be able to remove illness, negativity, misfortune. So you would take the cloth and you would wipe symbolically, energetically. It doesn't have to be like a literal wiping of your skin, even just slightly off the skin can still work. You're removing illness, you're removing those things that are unwanted, and then you would burn that cloth. And again, what you'd be doing when you burn it is transmuting and transforming that energy. So find a clean spot, take your Pysanka, and you're going to hold it not on top of the flame, but just to the side of the flame. You can even get really close to the flame, almost like the flame is touching or licking the egg itself. Let the beeswax melt and then wipe to reveal the design, the prayer written underneath. Get a new spot, clean spot on your cloth, and continue to wipe. So I'm warming up the beeswax. You're only going to do a little area at a time. Wipe it off, wipe it as clean as you can. And go to the next spot. As you're doing this, I recommend to, continue to think about, feel into the prayer that is written on your Pysanka. It's just good to stay present to the energies that this Pysanka represents. So I'm going to continue to wipe, and I'll reveal this at the very end. So I'm coming close to the last few wipes on the Pysanka. I'll show it to you as I complete, and then we're going to do one last step to finish our Pysanka. One of the things around working with handwork traditions is developing patience. And I actually think that that's a really important skill for these times. We spend so much time on devices that feed us information very quickly that we tend to get impatient. Pysanka such as this, it requires us to be patient in the sense that as we reveal a little bit at a time, sometimes the desire or the tendency is to want to get it all wiped off all at once. We might be clumsy if we go too quickly. I have had the unfortunate experience of having completed a Pysanka that took me hours to write and all of the dye work on it, etc., just to be disrupted by thoughts or maybe even by other people, coming in while I'm doing my work. And all of a sudden the Pysanka jumps out of my hand onto the ground, breaks. And when that happens, it's a really important reminder to me. I feel like, I'm not upset with, the interruption. I'm upset with myself because I know better. And what I know is that if there's something that's interrupting my concentration, and trust me, this is challenging to do while I'm talking. If there's something that's interrupting my concentration, I actually have to be even more and more present, or I need to pause. Pausing and bringing my attention to whatever else is, asking for it, whether it's a person trying to talk to me about something or my cat or whatever, or just an intrusive thought. Pausing, taking care of what's needing attention, and then coming back to the practice is far more productive than trying to push through. Now, mind you, I'm demonstrating something to you, so I kind of have to do both at once. So once I have taken all of the beeswax off, I do a final inspection. Is there any little spots that I've missed? If I suspect there's a couple places that I've missed, I'll just bring it back to the flame, give it a little wipe. Sometimes you can feel bits of wax with your fingers. Ideally, they will glide smoothly over the surface. Okay. Blessings and thank you. Here is the final Pysanka. The very last step is that we're going to apply just a touch of oil onto the surface of the Pysanka. Any kind of oil will do. Olive oil. I actually have never tried coconut, so I don't know how well that would apply because you'd need the Pysanka to be warm, and I would imagine it leaves a film as it cools. So I would stick with things like olive oil or sunflower oil, things like that. And you'll see that at first it's just really, really shiny. What this does is it helps to fix the dye. It basically protects the dye. Now, this is a natural dye. It does not behave the same as the chemical dyes, which means that we have to take extra care with it. And what I mean by extra care is if you were to expose your Pysanka to sunlight for, several hours a day, meaning if you put it in a place where it's going to have direct sunlight on it, you will probably notice that the Pysanka will begin to fade quickly because that's natural dye. It's not to say that it's not color fast, but if you want your Pysanka to last for years, and they can, then best to keep it out of direct sunlight. You can have it in a room that has natural light. Just don't put it right on the windowsill or close to the windowsill. Now, I'll let this sit for 24 hours before I put it with the other Pysanky that are for the exhibit so that it can fully absorb the oil. You'll notice within 24 hours it won't be shiny like this. But it's really lovely to have the oil because it does deepen the colors. And I really appreciate your patience in this project. There's so many different steps to it. So enjoy spring and enjoy your new found skill. Blessed be.